I want to take a moment before speaking about our Torah portion to acknowledge an amazing moment in American religious history, amazing moment for our Catholic brothers and sisters that the first American Pope has just been designated, and it's an incredible moment. And we want to bless him, bless the work of his hands, and just acknowledge what an important moment this is for religious life across the world, but also for in this country. This week, we approach, as I said in the beginning of, but when we laid the Torah on the table, we're approaching the heart center of the Torah. Leviticus is the middle book of the Torah, and Kedoshim, which we read this morning, is the middle portion. So Kedusha, or holiness, is our topic in all of its enigmatic simplicity. We read in the opening of our Parashat, Daber el kol edat b'nei Yisrael, speak to the whole Israel community, and say to them, Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. You shall be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy. Is holiness about morality? Is it about drawing boundaries between the sacred and the profane? Is it a state or a trait or both? And what does it mean that the reasoning behind the injunction to be holy, at least to this part of the Bible, is based on the assertion that God is holy? Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, notes that Kedusha, holiness, reflects the Torah's concern not only with behavior, but also with our characters. Not just with what we do, but with the kind of person we become. This week, we also encounter what scholars consider the epicenter of Leviticus, the pasuk that Rabbi Akiva considered the Torah's greatest principle, which is, of course, Leviticus 19:18. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your fellow or your neighbor as yourself. So, there's a story that Professor Rabbi Heschel asked a group of students at JTS if they could remove any of the commandments from the Torah, which ones would they excise? And the students were silent. They felt maybe the best thing to do was to not answer that question. And after a few moments, Rabbi Heschel shared that if he could, he would remove Exodus 19:18, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The students were, of course, shocked. And Heschel explained that this commandment, he said, is simply impossible to fulfill. And yet, it's so important, it's the basis of all civilization. So the verse presents a paradox. It's probably the most central of all commandments, and yet Rabbi Heschel and others have found it nearly impossible to complete, and some people think it's even very difficult to understand. So in order to unpack it, we'll first consider the unusual preposition in the phrase, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Rabbis over the generations have asked, why lamed, why l, which means to or for, instead of et, the direct object? So a better, although clunkier interpretation might be something like love for your fellow or love for your neighbor. So Nachmanides, one of our medieval commentators, believed that this preposition, le, indicates that this is a commandment that is to be interpreted as pertaining to behavior, and probably, he thought, not emotions. Nachmanides believed it might be psychologically impossible for a person to feel love for another in exactly the way she loves herself. But Nachmanides said a person can act in loving ways towards another, And understanding that is the key to understanding why the Torah uses the preposition le and not et. So many people feel uncomfortable with the idea that the Torah is commanding an emotion, demanding that we feel a certain way. However, Rabbi Shai Held believes that the Torah does precisely this. It commands emotion and not just action. Rabbi Held argues in his gorgeous book, Judaism is About Love, that our culture's fixation with a cult of spontaneity has sold us this myth that our emotions are beyond our control, when in fact, he says, there's much we can do to cultivate love. However, the premise that love for our neighbor can and should be cultivated does not clarify how to do this. It only emphasizes the complexity of the commandment, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I would direct you to Rabbi Held's book to look at his suggestions for how we might go about doing this, because I want to take us in a slightly different direction. When we step back and really take these words in, we realize the enormity, the complexity of the charges put forward in Kedoshim. What does it really mean to be holy? What does it mean to love? How is it possible to care for someone who's not our kin as much as we love ourselves? The key in trying to inculcate this love for others ties back to the opening verse that we talked about in the beginning of Kedoshim. It is only when we recognize the underlying oneness, the connectedness of all that is God, that we can concretize the commandment to love our fellow as ourselves. So it is, in fact, difficult, if not impossible, to love your fellow as yourself unless and until you can see the spiritual logic of the verse that the Parsha opened with. Speak to the entire community and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy. Let's unpack this idea, the connection between God being holy, us being holy, and how we go about loving our neighbor as ourselves. It's clear that holiness involves drawing boundaries. In Leviticus, we learn that an important part of love is respect for boundaries, that we must approach a beloved with sensitivity and attunement, with appropriate proximity. This is one of the lessons we learn from the tragic death of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. They desired to bring a korban, a sacrifice, to draw close to God, but they neglected to respect the rules of engagement, the boundaries. In human-to-human interactions, unwanted affection or touch can create trauma. And in human-divine interactions, we see that it results in death sometimes, as we saw in the case of Nadav and Avihu. So recognizing and respecting that you are separate from me, that you have your own needs and desires and beliefs is the first step to me transcending my own selfishness. But if I only recognize our separateness, if I fail to see the unity underlying all, then I will also fall short of holiness, because I will miss out on appreciating our connectedness. The oneness of God, the unity, means that if God is holy, we are holy too. In the moments when it's possible to appreciate the depth of that connectedness, of the holiness in every one of us, then it becomes clear in that moment that we must act with reverence towards others, towards humanity, towards all living things. In Genesis Rabbah, Rabbi Akiva is quoted as saying again, this is the greatest principle of Torah, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he goes on to say, meaning one should not say, since I've been scorned, I'm going to scorn my fellow. Since I've been cursed, I'm going to curse you. Rabbi Tanhuma says, if you do this, if you scorn your fellow or curse them, know that God made that person you put to shame in God's own image. A few years ago, I heard Rabbi Held say something provocative, that I thought it was provocative, that helped me understand why, despite pew studies and hand-wringing over declining participation in churches and synagogues, our faith communities are persisting. He said that he wished he could believe there was a way to chart a course towards a moral and just society through atheism, but he didn't believe that ultimately it's possible. That is not to say, of course, that one cannot act justly and morally without believing in God. Of course one can, and there are many, many examples. But I think that what Rabbi Held meant is that in terms of finding underlining meaning and purpose for these moral actions, it's impossible without a belief that there's something larger than ourselves that binds us all together, that holiness exists and that it's something that we can aspire to. When we connect to what Rabbi Shefa Gold calls the divine core of holiness, it is precisely then that we can cultivate our ability to love our fellow human beings as we love ourselves. May we, in the days to come, merit the capacity to grow in holiness and to nurture our ability to love each other. Shabbat Shalom.